Well, our passage today is that Pentecost passage from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 1 through 21. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Well, I don't have one of those fish symbols on my car. And the reason I don't have a fish symbol on my car is that the way I drive is not always a credit to Christianity. And so I figured that I would want to save the faith a certain level of embarrassment by not putting that fish on my car. And I wonder if there's anything in your life where you feel the same way, that if someone had, that GoPro following you around, how much of it would be in keeping with a person who's in church at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning on a beautiful day, and how much maybe is not quite in keeping. See, there's always a certain conflict between what we consider to be socially acceptable and what we consider to be faithful behavior. They overlap, but they aren't the same on either end of the spectrum. And we see that in our passage today. What we have in our passage is that the Spirit comes, and the Holy Spirit is so un-Presbyterian, because the Spirit is so disorderly. Presbyterians, we have this history, we're not called the frozen chosen for nothing, of liking things, in order. And the Spirit comes and upsets that order. The Spirit likes to come and move where it will and do things that amaze people. And it says here in the passage that they were amazed and perplexed. And the people look at it and their presumption is, they're drunk. Right? They must be drunk. See, the Spirit does that. The Spirit will have you move in ways that you weren't expecting and in ways that people don't necessarily think is becoming. And Peter defends against this charge. He doesn't say, "Oh no, that's ridiculous." Peter gives this defense that says, "Look, they're not drunk. It's 9 in the morning." Okay? This passage doesn't play on a college campus. 9 in the morning, they can't possibly be drunk. But you see, it's socially unacceptable to be drunk, but apparently it's not socially unacceptable to be drunk. I guess in that context, it's only socially unacceptable to be drunk at 9 in the morning. So it's no, they're not drunk, it's 9 in the morning. They wouldn't start drinking till cocktail hour at least. But it sets up this contrast between what we expect to be socially acceptable behavior and what we expect to be faithful behavior. And like I said, they overlap, but they're not consistent on either end. See, if you think about it, it's kind of like this. That you have like this range of behavior that's socially acceptable, and you have this range of behavior that's faithful. And most of us, I think, actually try to live in the middle where they overlap. We try to stay in that overlap where we try not to do these things that are over in socially acceptable but not really faithful. That might be like being, going out and partying a little too hard. Might be something that's socially acceptable. People do that, but maybe not something entirely consistent with being faithful, okay? And then you can be faithful in a way that's not really socially acceptable. So you can have folks who sit there and go, wow, that's a little much. That's a little overboard. And so a lot of times our tensions come when we are these two figurines there in these two parts of the world, where you have that one, the purple person there, who's really, that purple person to me represents the person who's always asking, is this a sin? Is this a sin? Because they're really trying to understand. You see, they want to do it, and they think there's really not too much wrong with doing it, but they just want to know if they can keep one toe in the faithful territory while still doing something that they want to do. And so the purple person is sitting there asking, is this a sin? But really, there's another tension over on the right side of the screen where that red figure sits, who is faithful but not really socially acceptable. Now, here's the thing I want to say as an aside about the person in that red zone. When we talk about a person who is being faithful but not socially acceptable, sometimes a really negative image comes to mind because that's the way certain people would like to portray it. There are a lot of people out there in the world who are displaying sexism, homophobia, and saying it's because of their faith. They're attributing it to their Christian faith. And so they're trying to say, we're this red figure over here. We're being so faithful, but people don't like us, okay, for being so faithful. And that's actually not true. The persons who are claiming prejudices and then masking it as faith are not the red people. They're actually the purple people. They're actually purple people who are trying to take secular prejudice and call it religion. They're trying to take secular prejudice and put it into the faithful territory. So they like to go out in the world and portray themselves as living in the red zone, but actually they're in that purple area of trying to bring prejudice into faith. Okay? But instead, you see, people of faith are unacceptable in a different way that we often don't think about. But we, as people of faith, we are called to move out of that socially acceptable zone. I've been reading, this week I was reading a lot. I've read him before. He's a wonderful author, a guy named Bob Goff. If you ever get a chance to read his books, he's got an interesting story. He's a lawyer. And he was really involved in Uganda for a time and helping, trying to end child slavery and things like that. And he wrote a couple of books. One is called, his theme is loving folks, okay? So his first book was called Love Does. And then his second book's just called Love Everybody Always, which sums up his understanding of Christian faith. But he writes about the fact that when you do this, it is going to take you into this socially unacceptable zone of loving people beyond what a lot of folks think is socially acceptable. But he writes this. He says, people who follow Jesus are no longer typical. God is constantly inviting them into a life that moves away from typical, okay? Moves away from typical in love, in generosity, in courage. That one of the reasons why our first core value that we talk about is living boldly is I think that one of the basic ways in which Christians can be atypical is by simply obeying that phrase that shows up in the Bible over and over and over, be not afraid. Be not afraid. And yet we live so often in fear of losing this, fear of not having that, and we can be such an example to the world if we would simply be not afraid. We move away from typical. But the example that he gives of talking about this is one of the ways in which I think it is really hard for us to really be faithful, because it takes us into a zone that is socially unacceptable. That's when he writes this. He says, there's a big difference between liking Jesus. It's really socially acceptable in this country to like Jesus. Okay? There's a big difference between liking Jesus and being like him. Because remember, being like Jesus got Jesus killed. Okay? So let's not forget that. Being like Jesus, which Jesus, who's more like Jesus than Jesus, got him killed. Okay? So there's a big difference between liking Jesus and being like him. And he said we would never be able to be like him unless we loved our enemies. That's hard. Loving your enemies? That's really hard. See, there's a real reason why it's hard. It's a very simple thing with me. I mean, I hear the command, love your enemies. It starts with this, love my enemies. I don't like my enemies. Okay? I mean, that makes it hard to begin with. It's hard because it's not the intellectual understanding of it. It's that visceral thing of, guess what? I don't like my enemies because they're my enemies. So it makes it really hard to wrap my arms around the idea that I need to love my enemies if I'm going to be like Jesus. And it starts to offend people in so many different ways when people are your enemies. You know, why did they become your enemies? Probably because they did something to you. And if they did something to you, what are you supposed to do? Forgive them. And that's hard. All right. It's really hard to do that. But you have to decide, do you want to be like everybody else? Or do you want to be like Jesus? What's your goal? You want to be like the world that says eye for eye? You want to be like the world that says, someone does for you, you got to do to them, or the world saying you got to do to them before they do to you? Do you want to be like that, or do you want to be like Jesus? It's a choice. We have to decide what that choice is going to be. So I like what Bob writes about this choice that you make. He writes this, a little bit of a long quote here. He says, if you want to become love, stop just agreeing with Jesus. Go call someone right now. Lift them up in ways they can't lift themselves. Send them a text message and say you're sorry. I know they don't deserve it. You didn't either. Don't put a toe in the water with your love. Grab your knees and do a cannonball. Don't just love the people who are easy to love. Go love the difficult ones. Equally important, as you practice loving everybody always, what will happen along the way is you'll no longer be who you used to be. God will turn you into love. And what does it mean to be love? I think it means that we start to simply embody love with who we are and what we do. And in fact, it was really funny. I saw him give a talk a couple years ago, and a friend of mine and I were discussing the fact that one of the most impressive things was something that just happened out of the blue. He gets on stage. It's big conference, 3,000 people there. He gets on stage, and these large conferences like that, they have these huge tech teams, and everything is just perfect, okay? But he gets on, and his mic doesn't work. I mean, that's just hugely embarrassing. He's trying to work his crackle. It's not working. Nothing's going right. And finally, a tech guy, this should never happen at a big conference like this. Or, like I said, 3,000 people there. The tech guy's got to come on stage from the wings, and swap out his belt pack and run a new microphone up. And Bob was just laughing and joking through the whole thing. And then, before he launches into his talk, as the guy is walking off stage, he asked everybody to give these techs a round of applause because they have a tough job. And very few people ever thank them. And they only really notice them when something goes wrong and they have to come on stage in the middle of a talk to change a microphone. Okay? that gave everything he said so much credibility. Can you imagine if he had even shown with a look on his face that he was annoyed that this had happened, and then he's going to talk about becoming love? Wouldn't work. But instead, he just embodied everything that he was going to talk about. And when we embody love, if that becomes what we're known for, it changes everything around us. And that's how we influence the world. You know, in political discourse, if you follow the news, and I know it can be kind of frustrating, but in political discourse, you've heard a lot of references in the past few years to something called the Overton window. How many of you have heard that term? Okay. The Overton window is named for this guy named Joseph Overton, who was a think tank person. He died a few years ago. And the Overton window is simply an idea that there is a range of acceptable ideas in public discourse. And so there's a certain thing, you know, so in certain policy ideas, you can be on the left or you can be on the right, and you can put forth policy ideas, but there are always certain ideas that are considered to be like in the acceptable range of discourse. And then any idea that's outside of that range, the person, the idea, the whole thing is just automatically dismissed. That'll never happen. That can't happen. Okay? And so the Overton window is the idea that you just have at any given point in time this range of ideas that's acceptable to talk about. All right? And so, for instance, a prayer request came in right today talking about wearing orange for gun safety. One of the ideas in the United States that would be outside the Overton window would be banning the private ownership of guns. Okay? If you advocated that, you're outside the Overton window. Nobody is taken seriously if they were to say that. All right? On the other side, he said, there should be no restrictions at all. If you want a machine gun, own a machine gun. Also outside the Overton window. Okay? That's too far in the other direction. But within the range of discourse, that discourse shifts over time. And so there was a time when talking about single-payer health insurance was outside the Overton window, and now it isn't anymore, okay? There's ideas, they come in and out. The window moves to the left, it moves to the right, it gets broader, it gets narrower, okay? And things move over time. But the thing about that window is that the thing that moves the window is the expression of ideas outside of it. That's how the window moves, okay? The window moves because someone is willing to put an idea out there and be just dismissed for putting it out there, to have the idea dismissed and have their own political viability be dismissed because they're talking crazy, all right? But if they do that, and if enough people do that, it begins to shift the window. And so what happens is that if people of faith go out and we just love beyond reason, if we're just generous beyond reason, you know, if we're just peacemakers beyond reason, it will begin to shift the window. All right? If we would just do that and say, you know what? Yes, you can tell me that this love your enemies thing doesn't work, but we just keep being known as people who love our enemies. Yeah, this generosity thing, you know, you got to be careful. Be worried about getting scammed. There's a lot of scammers out there. And yeah, we want to be good stewards of our funds, but we don't want good stewardship to get in the way of helping someone who's actually in need. You know, we have to do that. We have to work for peace. We have to do more than what people think a normal person would do. And then the window shifts. Yeah. There's lots of areas where that window shifts over time. You know where one area just came to mind that I think the window is shifting? Tipping. I think tips are just getting bigger. Okay? And what used to be an extraordinarily generous tip isn't anymore. That's now becoming normal because people tipped more, they talked about it, you know. And And now I think, when I grew up, everybody said 15%, and I think 15% is actually low now. Okay? I think most people are 20 or above. But it wasn't when I was growing up. It was, 15 was a good, solid tip. But I think that's just a case of behavior moving the window. And what if people of faith just lived in this window where we said we're going to be more loving than people think we ought to be. We're going to be more accepting than people think we ought to be. We're going to be more forgiving than people think we ought to be. If we just would do that, eventually that window moves and we start pulling what's thought of as the way to be toward the way Christ would want us to be. See, when Peter's talking about what happens at Pentecost with the Spirit coming, he says, "Your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams." Those visions and those dreams are not of a world that we see in front of us. Those visions and those dreams are of a world that we don't think can be. That's what makes them dreams, right? What makes it a vision, what makes it a dream, is that it's unreal in the moment. And yet the Spirit came to help us see that what's unreal in the moment might actually be possible. So I hope that we would allow the Spirit to come on us and move us to be faithful beyond the practical, to be faithful beyond what seems to make sense, to love our enemies, to help the needy, to dream of a world of acceptance and equality in every way, where every single person gets to be fully loved, fully looked at as a child of God. Even when people tell us that's not very practical. But if we live as if it is, we can change what people think. And that, more than any argument that we can make to people, all right, moves people. Bob Goff, I'll end with this. As I said, he's an attorney. And he said he just learned over the years that he just needed to try and be like Jesus to bring people to Jesus. He said there's too great a temptation to be Jesus' attorney and defend him. And he said he learned one simple thing. Jesus doesn't need an attorney, and if he did, you're not good enough to be it. But what you can do is try to be like him. And if we would all do that, it would begin to move the world.